I don't know where you're watching this from. Maybe you're sitting quietly after a long day, caring for someone who's never truly thanked you, or maybe you've been overlooked by those you gave your heart to. Her name was written in invisible ink across 15 years of devotion. Maria Gonzalez was forgotten the moment she became indispensable. It doesn't matter what time it is or how heavy your heart feels, but I promise, today's story will touch something deep inside you. The morning light filtered through the towering windows of the Beaumont penthouse on East 73rd Street, casting long shadows across Italian marble floors that cost more than most people earn in a year. Maria's weathered hands moved with practiced grace as she prepared breakfast, her steps silent against the cold stone. At 52, her dark hair was streaked with premature silver, pulled back in a neat bun that never allowed a strand to fall out of place. She wore the same navy cardigan every morning, its sleeves rolled up to reveal hands that told stories, hands that had soothed fevers, wiped tears, and applauded first words that no one else bothered to celebrate. The Beaumont mansion breathed with the rhythm of enormous wealth. Richard Beaumont III had built his fortune through strategic investments in emerging markets. His portfolio diversified across tech stocks, real estate holdings, and even cryptocurrency ventures that generated millions in passive income. His net worth exceeded $40 million, a number that seemed to grow effortlessly while he slept. The kitchen alone, with its imported German appliances and countertops carved from single slabs of Carrara marble, was worth more than the modest Queen's apartment where Maria had raised her own daughter, before loss taught her that love and money moved in opposite directions. Every morning, Maria would arrange fresh orchids in crystal vases throughout the 12-room penthouse, their petals perfect and untouched, like everything else in this house that gleamed but never warmed. She could hear the distant hum of Richard's conference calls echoing from his oak-paneled home office, his voice sharp and commanding as he discussed quarterly earnings and dividend payouts with investors in Tokyo and London. His wife, Catherine, when she lived, had been equally consumed by charity galas and social obligations that took her far from the daily rhythms of motherhood. It was in this cathedral of marble and silence that Maria first met Emily Rose Beaumont, then just 6 months old, her tiny fists curled around nothing but air. The moment Maria lifted that baby, something ancient and wounded stirred in her chest, a place she had sealed shut 5 years earlier when her own little girl, Sophia, had slipped away in a Chicago hospital room, claimed by leukemia that no amount of prayer or love could cure. Emily's first smile had been for Maria, her first steps taken toward Maria's outstretched arms, her first word, a soft mama that made Richard's jaw tighten with disapproval. "She's confused," he would say curtly whenever Emily reached for Maria instead of him. "Children need to understand boundaries. You're the help, Maria, nothing more." The words stung like winter wind, but Maria absorbed them silently. The way she absorbed all the small cruelties that came with loving in the shadows. She learned to step back when photographers arrived for family portraits, to remain invisible during birthday parties and holiday celebrations, to love fiercely while pretending indifference. Her devotion lived in the spaces between, in midnight fevers soothed with cool washcloths and Spanish lullabies, in scraped knees kissed better when no one was watching, in the gentle corrections that shaped Emily's tender heart. The Beaumont money flowed like water, effortless and endless. Richard's wealth generated more wealth through carefully managed investment portfolios, his assets distributed across blue-chip stocks, municipal bonds, and international funds that required no emotional labor from him whatsoever. His home smart system could adjust temperature, lighting, and security with voice commands, but it couldn't detect the subtle changes Maria noticed in Emily's behavior, the way her laughter had grown quieter, her appetite smaller, her once bright eyes clouded with something that looked disturbingly like grief. Maria had arrived at the Beaumont penthouse through an agency that specialized in placing domestic workers with Manhattan's elite families. Her references were impeccable. 15 years of experience, fluent in English and Spanish, certified in infant CPR. and most importantly, a quiet dignity that wealthy families preferred in their staff. She needed the work desperately. Sophia's medical bills had drained her savings, and the grief counselor had suggested that caring for another child might help heal the hole in her heart. The salary was generous, $70,000 annually, plus health benefits and 2 weeks paid vacation, more money than Maria had ever seen. But she quickly learned that wealth created its own kind of poverty. The Beaumont family lived like beautiful strangers under the same roof, their days scheduled by assistants, their meals prepared by staff, their emotional needs outsourced to professionals. Richard worked 18-hour days, his attention consumed by acquisition deals and board meetings. Emily grew up surrounded by luxury, but starved for the simple presence of a parent who chose to be there, not because they were paid to be, but because love demanded nothing less. In the evenings, when Richard finally emerged from his office, he would pat Emily's head absently while scrolling through market reports on his phone. "How was your day, sweetheart?" he would ask, but his eyes never left the screen, never searched her face for the answer that mattered. Emily would chatter excitedly about discoveries at the park, about the butterflies she'd seen, about the story Maria had read to her, but Richard's responses came in distracted murmurs. "That's nice, honey. And ask Maria to help you with that." It was Maria who taught Emily to tie her shoes, to recognize letters, to share her toys with others. It was Maria who held her through thunderstorms, who celebrated each small triumph, who noticed when Emily's smile didn't reach her eyes. The child clung to Maria with desperate affection, sensing perhaps that love in this house was rationed like everything else, distributed according to schedules and convenience rather than need. The penthouse's walls were decorated with abstract art worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, but Emily's crayon drawings were relegated to the refrigerator in the staff kitchen, where only Maria would see them. There were photos of the Beaumont family in silver frames throughout the house, formal portraits taken by expensive photographers, but none included Maria, despite the fact that she appeared in the background of Emily's life more consistently than anyone else. On quiet Sunday mornings, when Richard played golf at his exclusive country club, Maria would take Emily to Central Park. They would feed ducks at the reservoir, ride the carousel, and share ice cream cones while sitting on benches worn smooth by countless New York stories. Emily would ask innocent questions that pierced Maria's heart. "Why doesn't Daddy come with us?" And, "Will you always be here, Maria?" These moments felt stolen, precious beyond any salary, because in them Maria could love without permission, without the careful boundaries that typically constrained her affection. The park was where Maria first noticed the changes in Emily. The 4-year-old who once ran ahead on chubby legs, laughing at pigeons and chasing butterflies, began to walk slower, to tire more easily, to rest her head against Maria's shoulder with an exhaustion that seemed too heavy for such a small body. Her appetite, once robust enough to finish entire plates of Maria's homemade mac and cheese, dwindled to picking at food with little interest. Most troubling of all, Emily's legendary chatter, the endless stream of questions and observations that had once filled their days, grew quiet, punctuated by longer and longer silences. Maria mentioned her concerns to Richard repeatedly, but his response was always the same dismissive wave. "Children go through phases," he would say, not looking up from his laptop. "She's probably just tired from all the activities you've been doing with her. Maybe you should let her rest more." But Maria knew the difference between ordinary childhood fatigue and something deeper, more troubling. She had memorized every line of Emily's face, every shift in her mood, every subtle change in her breathing while she slept. Sophia's illness had taught Maria to recognize the early whispers of sickness, the way a child's body began to conserve energy for battles that hadn't yet been named. Emily was fading, and no one with the power to help seemed willing to listen. The penthouse's morning routine continued unchanged, a symphony of privilege orchestrated by staff who moved like shadows through rooms that sparkled with cleanliness but echoed with emotional emptiness. Richard's breakfast was served on bone china, worth more per place setting than Maria's monthly rent, his coffee imported from estates in Jamaica and ground fresh each morning. He would scan the Wall Street Journal while eating, occasionally pausing to make notes about potential investment opportunities or to fire off emails to his financial advisors about market fluctuations that could impact his diverse portfolio. Emily would sit at the breakfast table, pushing scrambled eggs around her plate with a fork that seemed too heavy for her small hands. Her favorite stuffed rabbit, Mr. Whiskers, sat beside her chair, no longer the constant companion he had once been, but still close enough to provide comfort when the world felt too overwhelming. Maria would sit nearby, officially there to assist with Emily's meal, but really serving as a bridge between the child's need for connection and her father's emotional unavailability. "Emily, eat your breakfast," Richard would say without looking up from his newspaper, his tone carrying the automatic authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "Maria, make sure she finishes everything on her plate." But when Richard left for his office on the 42nd floor of a glass tower in Midtown, Emily's facade would crumble. She would curl up in Maria's lap, her small body fitting perfectly against the woman who had held her through countless storms, both literal and metaphorical. "My tummy hurts," she would whisper, or, "I'm so tired, Maria." And Maria would stroke her hair with infinite tenderness, humming the Spanish lullabies that had once comforted her own daughter through long nights in a hospital that smelled of antiseptic and broken dreams. The penthouse had every luxury imaginable. A home theater with leather recliners that cost more than some people's cars, a wine cellar climate-controlled to preserve bottles worth thousands of dollars each, a master bathroom with a soaking tub carved from a single piece of stone imported from Italy. But it lacked the simple warmth of a home where love was freely given and gratefully received. Emily grew up surrounded by beauty, but starved for the basic human connection that no amount of money could purchase. Maria tried to fill that void with her presence, her attention, her fierce protectiveness. She created traditions in the spaces Richard ignored. Bedtime stories told in both English and Spanish, afternoon tea parties with Emily's stuffed animals, art projects that turned the playroom into an explosion of color and creativity. She taught Emily Spanish words for everyday objects, sang songs passed down from her own grandmother, shared stories about her childhood in a small Texas town where families gathered on front porches to watch the sunset over fields that stretched to the horizon. But even as Maria poured her love into Emily's life, she remained acutely aware of her precarious position. She was not protected by family bonds or blood ties. Her employment could be terminated at Richard's whim, her presence erased as easily as deleting a contact from a phone. She lived in constant tension between the depth of her love for Emily and the superficiality of her official role, between the family she had created in her heart and the family that signed her paychecks. The first crack in this delicate balance appeared on a Tuesday morning in November, when Emily woke up with a fever that made her cheeks flush bright red and her eyes glassy with confusion. Maria found her in bed, shivering despite the cashmere blankets that surrounded her like a cloud, Mr. Whiskers clutched tightly in her arms as if the stuffed rabbit could somehow anchor her to safety. "My head hurts," Emily whispered, her voice small and fragile. "And I can't see the numbers on my clock." Maria's heart clenched with familiar fear. She had seen this before, in another child, in another lifetime that felt both distant and immediate. She pressed her palm to Emily's forehead, feeling the heat that radiated from her skin like a warning. This was not an ordinary fever, not the simple illness that children shake off after a day of rest and chicken soup. This was something deeper, more insidious, something that required immediate attention from people with medical degrees and diagnostic equipment. She called Richard's office immediately, her fingers trembling as she dialed the number she had memorized years ago. His assistant, a crisp woman named Margaret who treated domestic staff like inconvenient interruptions, answered on the fourth ring. "Mr. Beaumont is in a meeting," Margaret said without preamble. "Can this wait?" "Emily is sick," Maria said, struggling to keep her voice steady. She has a high fever and she's saying she can't see properly. She needs to see a doctor right away." There was a pause, the sound of papers shuffling in the background. "I'll pass along the message," Margaret said finally. "He'll call you back when he can." But Richard didn't call back for 3 hours, and when he finally did, his response was predictably dismissive. "Children get fevers all the time," he said, his voice distracted by whatever was happening in his office. "Give her some children's Tylenol and let her rest. If she's not better by tomorrow, we'll think about calling the pediatrician." "Mr. Beaumont," Maria said, choosing her words carefully, "this isn't a normal fever. She's having trouble with her vision, and she's unusually lethargic. I really think she should be seen today." Richard's tone sharpened with irritation. "Maria, you're not a doctor. You're letting your imagination run away with you. Emily will be fine. Just monitor her temperature and call me if it goes over 102. But Emily's temperature climbed steadily throughout the day, reaching 103.5 by evening, despite the fever reducer Maria had given her every 4 hours as directed." The child lay motionless in her bed, occasionally murmuring incoherently about butterflies and missing puzzle pieces, her small body fighting a battle that Maria could sense but not name. Maria sat vigil beside her, cooling her forehead with damp cloths, adjusting her blankets and whispering prayers in Spanish that rose like smoke toward heaven. When Richard finally arrived home at nearly 10 o'clock, his Italian leather shoes clicking against the marble floors with their usual authority, Maria met him at the door with barely contained desperation in her eyes. "She's worse," she said without preamble. "Her fever won't break, and she's been talking about things that don't make sense. She keeps asking for people who aren't here. Please, we need to take her to the hospital." Richard looked annoyed by the interruption to his evening routine. His tie was loosened, his usually perfect hair slightly rumpled from a long day of high-stakes negotiations that had successfully added another $2 million to his investment portfolio. He had just closed a deal to acquire a smaller tech company, the kind of victory that typically energized him, but now he faced the domestic crisis he had hoped would resolve itself without his intervention. "Let me see her," he said with a sigh that suggested he was humoring an overwrought employee rather than responding to genuine concern. Emily lay in her bed like a flower wilted by an unseasonable frost, her dark hair damp with perspiration, her breathing shallow and rapid. Mr. Whiskers had fallen to the floor, forgotten in her delirium. Richard stood in the doorway for a moment, his expression unreadable as he processed the sight of his daughter's obvious distress. "She looks a little warm," he admitted grudgingly, "but children are resilient. She'll probably be much better in the morning." Maria felt something crack inside her chest, a sound like glass breaking in slow motion. "Mr. Beaumont, please," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I raised my own daughter. I know when a child is seriously ill. Emily needs medical attention now, not tomorrow morning." For a moment, Richard's mask slipped, revealing a flicker of uncertainty beneath his usual confidence. But then his phone buzzed with an urgent email from Tokyo about market fluctuations, and the moment passed. His attention shifted automatically to the glowing screen, to the numbers that mattered more to him than the fevered child in the next room. "We'll see how she is in the morning," he said firmly. "Sometimes these things just need to run their course." Maria watched him walk away, his footsteps echoing down the hallway toward his master suite, with its king-sized bed and Egyptian cotton sheets worth more than most people's monthly salary. She returned to Emily's room and settled into the chair she had pulled beside the bed, preparing for a long night of vigilance. If Richard wouldn't act, she would keep watch, ready to call an ambulance if Emily's condition deteriorated further. The child's labored breathing filled the silence, each exhale a reminder of Maria's powerlessness in a house where her love carried no legal weight, where her 15 years of devoted service meant less than a single phone call to the right specialist. That night stretched endlessly, measured in doses of fever reducer and cool cloths changed every 20 minutes. Maria dozed fitfully in her chair, waking every time Emily stirred or whimpered in her sleep. Toward dawn, when the first pale light began filtering through the heavy curtains, Emily's fever finally broke. The crisis had passed, at least for now, but something fundamental had shifted between Maria and Richard. She had seen his priorities laid bare, had watched him choose financial obligations over his daughter's welfare, and the knowledge sat heavy in her heart like a stone. The incident became one more invisible wound in Maria's collection, one more moment when her expertise and love were dismissed by a man who measured everything in dollars, but understood nothing about the currency of care. Emily recovered over the next few days, her fever giving way to the resilient health of childhood. But Maria couldn't shake the memory of Richard's indifference, the casual way he had dismissed her concerns while his daughter burned with fever in her bed. Weeks passed, and life in the penthouse resumed its polished routine. Richard's investment in cryptocurrency had paid off handsomely, adding another $3 million to his portfolio almost overnight. He celebrated by purchasing a new Rolex and upgrading his country club membership to include additional golf privileges. Meanwhile, Emily's appetite continued to diminish. Her energy levels dropped, and she began experiencing dizzy spells that left her clinging to Maria's hand for stability. Maria documented every symptom, every change, keeping a careful log in a small notebook she hid in her purse. She researched Emily's symptoms online, using the public library's computers during her rare breaks, and what she found made her blood run cold. The combination of symptoms, fatigue, decreased appetite, occasional fever, vision problems, pointed toward possibilities that no one wanted to name. Illnesses that required immediate intervention from specialists who could cost more per consultation than Maria earned in a month. But Richard remained unmoved by her increasingly desperate attempts to communicate her concerns. "You're being dramatic," he said during one particularly tense conversation. "Emily is fine. She's just going through a phase. Children often become more subdued as they mature." The breaking point came on a gray February morning when Maria found Emily collapsed on the bathroom floor, too weak to stand after a dizzy spell that had lasted nearly 5 minutes. The child's lips were pale, her skin clammy with perspiration, her breathing shallow and irregular. Maria lifted her carefully, feeling how much weight Emily had lost, how fragile her small body had become. "We're going to the hospital," Maria said, reaching for her phone to call 911, but Richard intercepted her with a sharp command that stopped her in her tracks. "Put the phone down," he said, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to absolute control. "Emily is not going to any hospital. She's overtired, that's all. You've been filling her head with worries, making her think she's sicker than she is. You're creating problems where none exist." The accusation hit Maria like a physical blow. "Mr. Beaumont, I would never." "You would and you have," Richard interrupted, his face flushed with anger that seemed disproportionate to the moment. "You've been coddling her, encouraging her to be weak, to seek attention through illness. It's time for some boundaries, real boundaries." Maria stared at him in disbelief, Emily's frail body still cradled in her arms. "She collapsed, Mr. Beaumont. She couldn't stand up. How is that seeking attention?" But Richard had already made up his mind, influenced perhaps by stress from a recent market downturn that had temporarily reduced his net worth by several million, or maybe by the pressure of maintaining his image as a man in complete control of his empire. He needed someone to blame for the chaos that threatened his perfectly ordered world, and Maria, with her quiet concerns and persistent worry, made an easy target. "I think," he said slowly, each word calculated to inflict maximum damage, "that you've become too emotionally involved with my daughter. You're no longer thinking clearly about what's best for her. Maybe it's time we reconsidered your position in this household." The threat hung in the air like smoke from an extinguished candle, acrid and choking. Maria felt Emily's small arms tighten around her neck, the child's instinctive response to the tension crackling between the adults. In that moment, Maria understood that her love for Emily had become a liability, that her deep caring was being weaponized against her by a man who had never learned the difference between protecting and controlling. The humiliation was swift and public. Richard called a staff meeting in the kitchen that same afternoon, gathering the housekeeper, the cook, and the building's doorman to witness what he clearly intended as an object lesson in professional boundaries. Emily, still pale and unsteady, was sent to her room with instructions to rest and stop worrying about imaginary illnesses. "I want everyone to understand," Richard began, his voice carrying the same commanding tone he used in boardroom presentations to potential investors, "that we maintain certain standards in this household, professional standards. Maria has forgotten her place, overstepping boundaries in ways that are inappropriate and ultimately harmful to my daughter's development." Maria stood frozen beside the kitchen island, her hands clasped tightly in front of her to keep them from trembling. The marble countertop was cool against her hip, its expensive surface a stark reminder of the wealth that surrounded her, but would never protect her from moments like this. She could feel the other staff members' discomfort, their careful refusal to meet her eyes, as Richard dismantled her reputation with surgical precision. "Caring for a child requires objectivity," he continued, pacing behind the kitchen island like a prosecutor presenting his case. "Emotional involvement clouds judgment, creates unnecessary drama, and teaches children to use illness as manipulation. Maria has demonstrated that she cannot maintain the professional distance required for this position." The words landed like physical blows, each one carefully chosen to wound. Maria thought of the countless nights she had spent beside Emily's bed, not because she was paid overtime, but because love demanded nothing less. She thought of the first steps she had celebrated, the scraped knees she had kissed, the bedtime stories she had told in 2 languages to honor both Emily's heritage and her own. All of it was being rewritten as inappropriate, as overstepping, as harmful to the child she loved more than her own life. "Furthermore," Richard said, his voice growing colder with each word, "I believe Maria's constant worry and anxiety are being transmitted to Emily, creating psychosomatic symptoms that are ultimately more damaging than any supposed illness. A child who is constantly told she might be sick will begin to believe it, to manifest symptoms that have no real medical basis." The accusation was so unfair, so completely divorced from reality, that Maria felt dizzy with the injustice of it. She had never suggested illness to Emily, had never planted seeds of worry in the child's mind. If anything, she had worked to normalize Emily's symptoms, to provide comfort and stability, while quietly trying to advocate for proper medical attention through the only channels available to someone in her position. "Effective immediately," Richard announced, his words falling like a guillotine blade. "Maria's services will no longer be required. She has become too personally invested to provide the professional care my daughter needs." The silence that followed was deafening. Maria stood perfectly still, absorbing the magnitude of what had just happened. 15 years of devoted service, erased in a single moment of convenient scapegoating. 15 years of love, dismissed as unprofessional boundary crossing. The Emily she had raised from infancy, lost to her forever because she had dared to care too much, to worry too deeply, to love too fiercely. She found her voice, though it came out smaller than she had intended. "When do you want me to leave?" "Today," Richard said without hesitation. "Margaret has prepared your final paycheck, including severance. Your belongings can be packed and removed by this evening." Maria nodded once, her dignity intact despite the devastation crashing over her like waves against stone. She would not give him the satisfaction of tears, would not beg for reconsideration or mercy. She had learned long ago that strength sometimes required silence, that grace under pressure was its own form of resistance. "I'd like to say goodbye to Emily," she said quietly. Richard's expression hardened. "I don't think that's wise. A clean break is better for everyone, especially for her. She needs to understand that when someone leaves, they're truly gone. Drawn-out goodbyes only make the transition more difficult. The cruelty of this final denial cut deeper than all the rest. To love a child for 15 years and then vanish without explanation, without the closure that even strangers accorded each other, felt like a special kind of torture designed for the particular vulnerability of those who love other people's children as their own. Maria packed her few personal belongings into 2 cardboard boxes that she had retrieved from the building's recycling room. 15 years of her life fit easily into those modest containers. A few changes of clothes, toiletries, the small framed photo of Sophia that sat on her nightstand, and the collection of Emily's drawings that she had saved over the years. The artwork told the story of a little girl growing up, stick figures gradually becoming more sophisticated, colors chosen with increasing deliberation, messages written in careful block letters. "I love you, Maria, and Maria is the best, and happy birthday to my favorite person." As she folded Emily's drawings between sheets of tissue paper, her hands finally began to shake. These precious artifacts of their relationship were all she would have now, memories preserved in crayon and construction paper, proof that their love had existed, even if it was no longer acknowledged by the man who controlled Emily's world. The doorman helped her carry the boxes downstairs, his expression sympathetic but carefully neutral. He had worked in luxury buildings long enough to understand the unspoken rules that governed relationships between staff and residents. Emotional investments were always risky when your paycheck depended on maintaining professional distance. He had seen other domestic workers dismissed for similar reasons, their years of service erased by momentary inconvenience or imagined slights. As Maria waited for the taxi that would take her back to Queens, back to her small apartment that would feel impossibly empty after 15 years of purpose, she looked up at the penthouse windows one final time. She could see the soft glow of Emily's bedroom light, could imagine the child probably wondering where she had gone, why Maria hadn't come to read her a bedtime story or bring her the cup of warm milk that helped her sleep. The taxi pulled away from the curb just as snow began to fall, fat flakes that caught the streetlights and dissolved against the windshield like tears. Maria pressed her face to the window. Watching the elegant Upper East Side buildings give way to the more diverse landscape of Queens, where corner bodegas stayed open late and children played soccer in vacant lots and families gathered on stoops to share gossip and dreams in a dozen different languages. Her apartment on Roosevelt Avenue felt impossibly small after the vast spaces of the Beaumont penthouse, but it welcomed her with the authentic warmth that marble and crystal could never provide. The walls were painted a cheerful yellow that she had chosen herself, decorated with photographs of Sophia and thank you cards from previous families who had valued her service. Her small kitchen smelled of cumin and garlic from the Dominican restaurant downstairs, familiar scents that reminded her of home and community and the simple pleasure of belonging somewhere without conditions. That first night of unemployment, Maria sat at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had grown cold hours ago, staring at Emily's drawings spread across the worn formica surface like a map of love remembered. Each picture told a story. The purple butterfly Emily had drawn after their day in Central Park, the crooked house with smoke curling from its chimney, the family portrait that included Maria alongside Emily and Mr. Whiskers, all three of them smiling under a yellow sun with rays extending to the edges of the construction paper. She allowed herself to cry then, finally releasing the grief and rage and bewilderment that she had held in check during those final humiliating moments in Richard's kitchen. Her tears fell onto Emily's artwork, and she quickly dabbed them away with a tissue, afraid of damaging the precious evidence of their bond. These drawings were all she had left of the little girl who had called her name in the darkness, who had reached for her comfort before anyone else, who had loved her with the uncomplicated fierceness that only children possess. Sleep came in fragments that night, interrupted by dreams of Emily calling her name from rooms that grew more distant with each repetition. Maria would wake with a start, her heart pounding with the phantom urgency of a crying child who needed comfort, only to remember that Emily was no longer her responsibility, no longer within reach of her protection. The silence of her apartment echoed with absence, with the sudden vacuum created by the loss of purpose that had structured her days for 15 years. Meanwhile, across the city in the marble perfection of the Beaumont penthouse, Emily woke from restless sleep and padded barefoot to the kitchen, looking for the woman who had never missed a morning greeting in all her remembered life. The kitchen was pristine and empty, its granite surfaces reflecting the cold morning light that streamed through windows that had never known the touch of fingerprints or the chaos of real living. "Where's Maria?" Emily asked the housekeeper who was preparing her breakfast with efficient impersonality. "She doesn't work here anymore," came the careful reply. "Your father has made other arrangements for your care." Emily's small face crumpled with confusion and loss, but there was no one to comfort her. No gentle hand to stroke her hair or patient voice to explain why the most constant presence in her life had simply vanished overnight. She picked at her eggs without enthusiasm, her appetite disappearing along with the woman who had made breakfast feel like love rather than obligation. The next few weeks passed in a haze of interviews with potential replacement nannies, a parade of perfectly qualified women who possessed impressive credentials but lacked the indefinable quality that had made Maria irreplaceable. Richard approached the hiring process like any other business decision, creating spreadsheets to compare candidates' education levels, experience with wealthy families, and salary requirements. He seemed confident that Maria's departure would ultimately prove beneficial, that Emily would adjust quickly to a more professional arrangement, unburdened by excessive emotional attachment. But Emily didn't adjust. If anything, her condition worsened in Maria's absence, her appetite disappearing entirely, her energy levels dropping to the point where she could barely complete simple activities without becoming exhausted. The dizzy spells increased in frequency and intensity, sometimes leaving her unconscious for several frightening minutes. Most alarming of all, she began experiencing episodes where her speech became slurred and confused, as if her brain was struggling to connect thoughts to words. Richard, absorbed in managing a portfolio that had grown increasingly volatile due to global market instability, attributed Emily's decline to the natural adjustment period that followed any major change in routine. His cryptocurrency investments alone required constant monitoring, their values fluctuating wildly based on regulatory announcements and social media trends that could add or subtract millions from his net worth in a matter of hours. He told himself that Emily's symptoms were temporary, psychological responses to Maria's departure that would resolve once she accepted the new normal. But the new nannies, despite their professional qualifications, began expressing concerns that echoed Maria's earlier warnings with increasing urgency. The third woman he hired, a former pediatric nurse named Jennifer, lasted only 2 weeks before requesting a private meeting that Richard couldn't ignore. "Mr. Beaumont," Jennifer said, her voice steady but her expression grave, "I need to speak with you about Emily's health. I have 30 years of experience working with children, and I'm deeply concerned about several symptoms she's displaying. She needs to see a pediatrician immediately and possibly a specialist." Richard felt a familiar flash of irritation at what he perceived as another example of female overreaction to normal childhood developments. "What exactly are you suggesting?" "Sir, Emily has lost 12 pounds in the 6 weeks since I started working here. She's experiencing severe fatigue, frequent dizzy spells that sometimes result in brief losses of consciousness, and episodes of confusion that suggest possible neurological involvement. These symptoms, taken together, could indicate a serious underlying condition that requires immediate medical evaluation." The words hung in the air like acrid smoke. Impossible to ignore now that they had been spoken by someone with medical training and professional credibility. Richard found himself remembering Maria's earlier concerns, the worried expression that had crossed her face whenever Emily exhibited unusual fatigue, the gentle way she had tried to advocate for medical attention that he had dismissed as unnecessary drama. For the first time in months, he really looked at his daughter, not the quick glance he usually spared between phone calls and emails, but a sustained examination of the child who had somehow faded while he wasn't paying attention. Emily sat at the breakfast table, pushing scrambled eggs around her plate with a fork that seemed too heavy for her thin arms. Her cheeks, once rounded with healthy childhood fullness, had grown hollow, her skin pale except for the dark circles that shadowed her eyes. She moved with the careful deliberation of someone much older as if each gesture required conscious effort and planning. "When did she lose so much weight?" he asked, though the answer felt dangerous, loaded with implications he wasn't ready to face. According to the previous nanny's notes, the weight loss has been gradual but consistent over several months. It's accelerated significantly in recent weeks, possibly due to increased stress from the staffing changes, but the underlying pattern was established long before I arrived. Maria's notes. Richard felt something cold settle in his stomach as he realized that Maria had been documenting Emily's condition with the methodical care of someone who understood that love sometimes required evidence, that advocacy meant building a case with facts rather than just intuition. The woman he had dismissed as overly emotional had been maintaining medical records that demonstrated a level of professional competence he had refused to acknowledge. "Schedule an appointment with Dr. Peterson," he said finally, naming the pediatrician he hadn't consulted in over 2 years. "Let's get Emily a complete checkup, just to be thorough." But Dr. Peterson, after examining Emily with growing concern, immediately referred them to Dr. Rachel Martinez, a pediatric hematologist-oncologist at Mount Sinai, whose reputation commanded both respect and fear among parents who found themselves suddenly navigating the specialized vocabulary of childhood illness. Dr. Martinez's office waiting room was decorated with cheerful murals and filled with toys, but the underlying purpose was unmistakable. This was where families came when ordinary pediatric care was insufficient, when something serious was stealing childhood away, one symptom at a time. Emily clung to Richard's hand during the examination, her small fingers cold despite the warm room, her eyes wide with the kind of fear that children absorb from adult anxiety, even when they don't understand its source. Dr. Martinez conducted her evaluation with gentle thoroughness, asking questions about Emily's medical history, her family's health background, and the timeline of her symptoms that Richard found himself unable to answer with any precision. "When did you first notice the fatigue?" Dr. Martinez asked, her pen poised over Emily's chart. "I'm not sure exactly," Richard admitted, feeling foolish and inadequately prepared. "The nanny mentioned some concerns a few months ago, but I didn't think they were significant. What about the weight loss? Has that been gradual or sudden?" Again, Richard found himself lacking the detailed knowledge that a parent should possess, the daily observations that would have been second nature to someone who shared meals with Emily, who helped her dress each morning, who noticed when clothes began hanging loose or appetite disappeared. Maria would have been able to answer these questions with the precision of a medical professional, could have provided dates and specific incidents and careful documentation of every subtle change. The preliminary tests, blood work, complete metabolic panel, imaging studies, revealed abnormalities that required additional investigation. Dr. Martinez spoke in the careful language of medical professionals who have learned to communicate devastating possibilities without destroying hope. But her meaning was clear enough. Emily's condition was serious, complex, and had been developing for months while the adults responsible for her care had been looking elsewhere. "I want to run some additional tests," Dr. Martinez explained gently. "We need to rule out several possibilities before we can determine the best course of treatment. In the meantime, Emily will need very careful monitoring, consistent medical support, and an environment that minimizes stress and maximizes emotional security." Emotional security. The phrase echoed in Richard's mind as he drove Emily home through Manhattan traffic that moved with its usual indifferent urgency. He thought of Maria's steady presence, her intuitive understanding of Emily's needs, her ability to provide comfort during frightening moments when medical uncertainty loomed large. He had dismissed her concerns as emotional overreaction, but now he wondered if her love had been the only clear-eyed assessment of Emily's condition, her worry the only appropriate response to symptoms that medical professionals were taking very seriously indeed. That evening, after Emily had fallen into the exhausted sleep that had become her normal state, Richard sat in his home office surrounded by the monitors and documents that typically demanded his full attention. The stock market had closed down significantly. Cryptocurrency values were fluctuating wildly, and his financial advisors were sending urgent recommendations about portfolio adjustments that could protect his wealth from continued volatility. But for the first time in years, the numbers felt abstract and unimportant, mere symbols on screens that had no power to address the only crisis that truly mattered. He found himself thinking about Maria's small notebook, the careful record-keeping that he had interpreted as obsessive attention to minor details. Now he understood that she had been building a medical history, documenting symptoms with the thoroughness of someone who understood that healthcare required evidence, that advocacy meant preparation, that love sometimes expressed itself through meticulous attention to changes that others might dismiss as insignificant. The realization struck him like a physical blow. Maria had been right about everything. Her concerns had been justified, her observations accurate, her advocacy appropriate and necessary. She had tried to protect Emily through the only means available to someone without legal authority or family status, and he had punished her for caring too much, had accused her of creating problems that were frighteningly real and potentially life-threatening. The next morning brought test results that confirmed Dr. Martinez's worst suspicions. Emily was diagnosed with a rare form of childhood leukemia, an aggressive condition that had been silently progressing for months while Richard dismissed symptoms as attention-seeking behavior or normal developmental phases. The diagnosis came with treatment protocols that would require immediate hospitalization, chemotherapy regimens that would devastate Emily's small body in the service of saving her life, and a prognosis that depended largely on how much damage the disease had already done during the months when it went undetected and untreated. Dr. Martinez delivered the news with professional compassion, outlining treatment options and survival statistics with the gentle directness that families facing childhood cancer must learn to navigate. But one comment struck Richard with particular force. Early detection and treatment significantly improve outcomes with this condition. Every month of delay can have serious consequences for long-term prognosis. Every month of delay. The words echoed through Richard's consciousness as he tried to process information about blast cells and treatment protocols and the PICU, where Emily would spend the next several weeks fighting for her life. Maria had been sounding alarms for months, begging for medical attention that could have made the difference between manageable treatment and the crisis they now faced. Her love had been prescient, her worry prophetic, her advocacy the kind of fierce protectiveness that children required, but rarely received from adults who prioritized convenience over vigilance. Emily's first night in the hospital was a kaleidoscope of monitors and IV lines and medical professionals who moved with quiet urgency through procedures that would become routine over the coming months. She looked impossibly small in the hospital bed, her dark hair stark against white pillows, her hand attached to tubes that carried medications designed to kill the disease, trying to steal her childhood. Richard sat beside her bed in a chair that would become his second home, finally understanding the vigil that Maria had maintained night after night when Emily's fever spiked or her breathing became labored. "I want Maria," Emily whispered during one of her few conscious moments that first night, her voice barely audible over the soft beeping of monitors that tracked her vital signs. "Why isn't Maria here?" The question pierced Richard's heart with surgical precision. How could he explain that Maria wasn't there because he had fired her for loving Emily too much, for worrying about symptoms that turned out to be early warnings of a life-threatening illness? How could he admit that his pride and prejudice had cost Emily the comfort of the one person who would have advocated for her without hesitation, who would have fought the medical system and insurance companies and anyone else who tried to minimize her condition? Maria had to go away, he said finally, the inadequacy of the explanation hanging between them like incense from a funeral service. "But I'm here now, sweetheart. I'm not going anywhere." But being present wasn't the same as providing comfort, and Richard discovered that his 15 years of emotional absence couldn't be remedied by suddenly increasing his physical proximity. Emily cried for Maria during medical procedures, reached for her during moments of confusion caused by medications, asked for the Spanish lullabies that had soothed countless other nights when sleep felt impossible. Richard tried to fill that void, but he lacked the intuitive understanding of Emily's needs that Maria had developed through years of patient attention, the gentle confidence that came from loving without conditions or limitations. The chemotherapy began 3 days after Emily's admission, a process that required careful coordination between oncology specialists, nursing staff, and child life therapists who helped young patients navigate the complex trauma of fighting disease through treatments that felt worse than the illness itself. Richard learned a new vocabulary of medical terms: blast cells and neutrophil counts and mucositis and the 100 other words that described what was happening to his daughter's body as medicine waged war against cancer, with weapons that couldn't distinguish perfectly between friend and enemy. Emily's hair began falling out during the second week of treatment, coming away in soft handfuls that the nurses collected matter-of-factly and disposed of as if childhood weren't being systematically dismantled, strand by strand. Richard watched his daughter transform from a vibrant little girl into a pale, bald patient whose days were structured around medication schedules and blood draws and the careful monitoring of symptoms that could signal complications requiring immediate intervention. It was during the third week of Emily's hospitalization that Richard finally admitted to himself what he had known since the moment Dr. Martinez delivered her diagnosis. He needed to find Maria. Not just because Emily kept asking for her, though that was heartbreaking enough. He needed Maria because she was the only person who truly understood his daughter's needs, who possessed the deep knowledge of Emily's personality and preferences that could help navigate the months of treatment ahead. More than that, he needed to apologize for the devastating injustice he had committed when he dismissed her concerns and fired her for loving Emily with the fierce protectiveness that the situation had actually required. Finding Maria proved more difficult than he had anticipated. His attempts to reach her through the employment agency that had originally placed her yielded only a polite message that former employees' contact information was confidential. The doorman at his building remembered that she had mentioned living in Queens, but Queens was enormous, a sprawling borough of neighborhoods and cultures that could hide one quiet woman among nearly 3 million residents. Richard hired a private investigator, a discreet professional who specialized in locating domestic workers who had left employment under various circumstances. The search took 2 weeks and cost more than Maria's annual salary, but eventually yielded an address on Roosevelt Avenue in a neighborhood that Richard had never visited, despite living in New York for most of his adult life. Maria's apartment building was a modest 4-story structure squeezed between a Dominican restaurant and a laundromat, its facade decorated with fire escapes and window boxes that blazed with flowers, tended by residents who understood that beauty didn't require expensive materials, only careful attention and love. The neighborhood hummed with life, children playing soccer in the street while their mothers watched from stoops. Elderly men gathered around folding tables for dominoes games that seemed to have no beginning or end, vendors selling fruit and vegetables from carts decorated with hand-painted signs in Spanish and English. Richard felt like an intruder as he climbed the narrow stairs to Maria's third-floor apartment, his expensive suit and obvious wealth marking him as an outsider in a community that had learned to be wary of people whose presence usually meant bad news. Immigration enforcement, code violations, rent increases, or evictions. The hallway smelled of cumin and garlic and other spices that told stories of home countries and family recipes passed down through generations of women who made magic happen in small kitchens with limited resources. He knocked softly on apartment 3B, his heart pounding with a mixture of shame and desperate hope. Footsteps approached from the other side of the door, followed by the sound of multiple locks being turned, the careful security measures of people who had learned that safety required vigilance and preparation. The door opened to reveal Maria, though she looked smaller somehow than he remembered. her face marked by lines of worry that hadn't been there during her years of employment in his house. She wore a simple house dress and slippers, her graying hair pulled back in the neat bun she had maintained throughout her years of service, but her eyes held a wariness that hadn't existed when she moved through his kitchen with quiet confidence and grace. "Mr. Beaumont," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "How did you find me?" "I hired someone," he admitted, suddenly ashamed of the invasion of privacy that the search had required. "Maria, I need to talk to you about Emily." He saw her face change at the mention of Emily's name, worry and love and fear flickering across her features like clouds racing across the sun. "Is she all right? What's wrong?" "She's sick," Richard said simply. "Very sick. She's in the hospital, and she keeps asking for you. The doctors say she has leukemia, that she's probably had it for months. They say that early detection could have made a difference in her treatment options." Maria's hand flew to her chest, her face growing pale as she processed the information that confirmed her worst fears. All those months of subtle symptoms, of careful documentation, of gentle attempts to advocate for medical attention. It had all been leading to this moment when her love-driven anxiety was vindicated by a diagnosis that no one wanted to hear. "Maria," Richard continued, his voice breaking slightly, "you were right about everything. Every symptom you noticed, every concern you raised, every time you asked me to take her to a doctor, you were trying to save her life, and I was too proud and stubborn and blind to listen. I fired you for caring too much about my daughter, and now she's fighting for her life while asking for the only person who ever really paid attention to what was happening to her body." Tears were streaming down Maria's face now, but she made no attempt to wipe them away. "Where is she? Which hospital?" "Mount Sinai. She's been there for 3 weeks, and the treatments they're very hard. She's lost all her hair, she's weak most of the time, and she cries for you every night. The nurses are wonderful, and I'm trying to be there as much as I can, but I don't know how to comfort her the way you always did. I don't know the songs she likes or how to make her laugh when she's scared. I realizes that you were more of a mother to her than I ever was a father." The admission hung between them like bridge spanning 15 years of misunderstandings and power imbalances, and the careful distance that wealth imposed on relationships that should have been built on mutual respect and recognition of shared humanity. Maria looked at this man who had controlled her livelihood for so many years, who had dismissed her expertise and fired her for loving his daughter, and saw not an arrogant employer, but a broken father, finally understanding the magnitude of his failures. "I'll come with you," she said simply, already moving toward her bedroom to gather her things. "Emily needs me." The ride to Mount Sinai was mostly silent, Richard navigating Manhattan traffic while Maria sat in the passenger seat of his Mercedes, her weathered hands folded carefully in her lap. She had changed into her best dress, a simple navy blue garment that she reserved for church and special occasions, and had brought a small bag containing Emily's favorite book, a stuffed animal she had bought months ago but never given, and the drawings Emily had made for her over the years, artwork that chronicled their relationship and might provide comfort during the long days of treatment ahead. As they approached the hospital, Maria asked the questions that a mother would ask. How is she eating? Is she able to keep food down during the treatments? Are they managing her pain adequately? Does she have a child life specialist helping her understand what's happening? Richard found himself unable to answer most of her questions with the specificity they deserved. Despite spending hours each day at Emily's bedside, he lacked the detailed knowledge of her condition that Maria would have possessed naturally, the intuitive understanding of her needs that came from years of putting her welfare above all other considerations. The pediatric oncology ward at Mount Sinai was designed to provide comfort and normalcy within the stark reality of childhood cancer treatment. The walls were painted in cheerful colors and decorated with artwork created by former patients, and the nursing staff moved with the special combination of professional competence and emotional warmth that families in crisis required. But beneath the surface decorations, it remained unmistakably a place where children fought battles that no child should face, where families learned new vocabularies of hope and fear that would shape their lives forever. Emily's room was a marvel of medical technology, filled with monitors and IV poles and equipment that tracked every aspect of her condition with digital precision. But in the center of all this machinery was a small, bald girl who looked lost, despite being surrounded by everything modern medicine could provide. Her eyes were closed when they entered, her breathing regular but shallow, her small hand resting on the hospital blanket that covered her diminished body. "Emily," Richard whispered, not wanting to wake her but needing her to know that he had brought the person she had been asking for every day since her admission. Emily's eyes opened slowly, unfocused at first from the medications that kept her pain manageable, but gradually sharpening as she processed the familiar voice. When she saw Maria standing beside her father, her entire face transformed with a joy so pure and overwhelming that both adults began crying simultaneously. "Maria!" Emily's voice was hoarse from the treatments, but it carried all the love and relief and desperate happiness of a child who had been calling for her mother and had finally been heard. "I knew you would come. I knew you wouldn't leave me." Maria moved to Emily's bedside with the practiced grace of someone who had spent years navigating around sleeping children, her hands immediately finding Emily's face, stroking her cheeks with infinite tenderness while her tears fell onto the hospital blanket. "Mi amor," she whispered in Spanish, using the endearment that Richard had never heard before, but that clearly held special meaning for both of them. "I'm so sorry I wasn't here sooner. I'm so sorry you've been scared without me." Emily tried to sit up, reaching for Maria with arms that shook from weakness but were fierce with determination. "The doctors are very nice, and Daddy stays with me every night, but I missed you so much. I missed your songs and your stories and the way you make everything feel safe." Maria gathered Emily into her arms as carefully as if she were made of spun glass, mindful of the IV lines and monitoring wires that connected her to the machines, keeping track of her vital signs. The reunion was wordless and complete, love flowing between them with the natural ease that had always characterized their relationship. Emily burrowed against Maria's chest with a contentment that spoke louder than any medical assessment about what kind of healing wasn't available in prescription bottles or treatment protocols. From his position beside the hospital bed, Richard watched this moment of pure connection and understood finally what he had been too blind to see during all the years when Maria had moved through his house like a guardian angel. She wasn't just an employee who happened to care about his daughter. She was Emily's second mother, the woman who had raised her with daily acts of love and sacrifice and patience that no salary could adequately compensate. Their bond wasn't a professional relationship that had grown inappropriately personal. It was a family tie that transcended biological connections and legal documentation, the kind of love that children needed in order to thrive and that no amount of money could purchase or replace. Emily's oncologist, Dr. Martinez, stopped by during evening rounds and was struck immediately by the change in her patient. Emily was more alert than she had been since treatment began, more responsive to questions, and more engaged with her surroundings. Most importantly, she was eating, actually consuming the hospital food that she had been pushing around her plate for weeks, encouraged by Maria's gentle coaxing and the simple comfort of having someone present who understood her preferences and could make even institutional meals feel like expressions of love. "You must be Maria," Dr. Martinez said, extending her hand to the woman whose name had appeared in Emily's medical files as the person she most wanted to see. "Emily has been asking for you every day. I think having you here is going to make a significant difference in her treatment response." Over the following weeks, Maria essentially moved into Emily's hospital room, sleeping in the reclining chair beside the bed and maintaining the around-the-clock vigil that comes naturally to mothers facing their children's mortality. She learned to navigate the complex schedule of treatments and medications, to recognize the subtle signs that indicated Emily was having a good day or struggling with side effects, to provide the kind of comfort that couldn't be prescribed but was essential to healing nonetheless. Richard marveled at Maria's intuitive competence, the way she seemed to know exactly what Emily needed before the child could articulate it herself. When nausea from chemotherapy made eating impossible, Maria produced homemade ginger tea that somehow stayed down when nothing else would. When insomnia from steroids made sleep elusive, Maria sang the Spanish lullabies that had soothed countless other restless nights, her voice soft and hypnotic in the dim hospital room. When fear made Emily anxious about upcoming procedures, Maria told stories that transformed medical treatments into adventures where brave princesses fought dragon diseases with the help of magical potions administered by wise healers. But perhaps most importantly, Maria served as Emily's advocate within the medical system, asking the detailed questions that Richard hadn't known to ask, noticing changes in Emily's condition that might have gone unrecorded, and ensuring that her voice was heard when treatment decisions were being made. She maintained a detailed notebook similar to the one she had kept during Emily's illness at home, documenting symptoms and responses to medications with the meticulous care that healthcare providers had learned to value from family members who were truly paying attention. The chemotherapy was brutal, as it always was, attacking Emily's cancer with weapons that couldn't distinguish between malignant cells and healthy tissue. Emily lost weight she couldn't afford to lose, developed mouth sores that made eating painful, and experienced fatigue so profound that some days she barely had energy to open her eyes. But through it all, Maria remained constant. A steady presence that anchored Emily to hope and healing and the absolute certainty that she was loved beyond measure. Richard found himself learning to be a father by watching Maria mother his daughter through the most challenging experience of their lives. He observed her patience during Emily's worst moments, her ability to remain calm when medical crises demanded quick decisions, her skill at advocating firmly but respectfully for Emily's needs when healthcare providers seemed rushed or inattentive. More than anything, he learned that effective parenting required a level of selflessness that he had never achieved, a willingness to put another person's welfare consistently ahead of your own comfort, convenience, or preferences. 3 months into Emily's treatment, her oncologist delivered news that felt like sunrise after the longest night in human history. Emily was responding well to chemotherapy, her blast cell counts had dropped dramatically, and preliminary indicators suggested that she was achieving the kind of remission that offered genuine hope for long-term survival. The road ahead would still be challenging, requiring months more of treatment and careful monitoring, but the prognosis had shifted from uncertain to cautiously optimistic. Emily celebrated this news with the resilience that children somehow maintain even when facing circumstances that would crush most adults. Her hair had begun growing back in soft, downy patches, her appetite was slowly returning, and she had regained enough strength to walk short distances around the pediatric ward. Most tellingly, her laughter had returned, tentative at first, but gradually regaining the musical quality that Maria remembered from their days in Central Park, feeding ducks and sharing ice cream cones. As Emily's condition stabilized and her discharge date approached, Richard knew that he had to address the elephant in the room, Maria's future role in their family. He couldn't simply ask her to return to her previous position as if nothing had happened, as if he hadn't fired her for the very qualities that had proven essential to Emily's survival. Their relationship had been fundamentally altered by the months of crisis, by his recognition of her true value and her demonstration of grace under circumstances that would have justified far less forgiveness. The conversation took place in the hospital cafeteria on a quiet Tuesday evening, while Emily slept peacefully for the first time in weeks. Richard had been rehearsing his words for days, trying to find language adequate to the magnitude of apology and the scope of his request. But when the moment arrived, formal speeches felt inadequate to the raw emotion of the situation. "Maria," he began, his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had grown cold while he summoned his courage. "I need to ask you something, but first I need to say things that I should have said months ago. I fired you for loving my daughter the way every child deserves to be loved. I dismissed your concerns when you were trying to save Emily's life. I accused you of being unprofessional when you were demonstrating the highest level of caregiving I've ever witnessed. I was wrong about everything, and my arrogance almost cost Emily her life. Maria listened without interrupting, her expression calm but attentive, giving him the space to say words that had been building pressure in his heart for months. I want to ask you to come back, Richard continued, not as an employee, not as hired help, but as family. I want to adopt you legally if you'll let me, make you Emily's official guardian so that you'll never again have to worry about being dismissed or losing access to the child you've raised with more love and dedication than I managed in 7 years of biological parenthood. The offer hung between them like a bridge spanning not just their personal history, but centuries of social conventions that dictated how relationships between employers and domestic workers were supposed to function. Richard was proposing something radical, the formal recognition of bonds that had always existed but had never been legally acknowledged, the transformation of an economic arrangement into a family structure that honored the reality of their emotional connections. Maria was quiet for a long time, her weathered hands folded on the cafeteria table, her eyes focused on something beyond Richard's shoulder. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of 15 years of silent dignity and the hard-won wisdom that comes from loving without guarantee of recognition or protection. "Mr. Beaumont," she said softly, "I don't need legal papers to be Emily's family. I've been her mother in every way that matters since she was 6 months old. But I do need your promise that you'll never again dismiss my concerns about her welfare, that you'll trust my judgment when it comes to her health and happiness, and that you'll understand that my love for her isn't something I can turn on and off according to employment status." "You have that promise," Richard said immediately, "and you have my apology for every moment when I failed to recognize what you were giving to our family. You have my commitment to making sure that Emily grows up knowing exactly how much you sacrificed to keep her safe and healthy and loved." Maria nodded slowly, accepting the promise and the apology with the dignity she had maintained throughout their entire relationship, even during its darkest moments. "Then yes, I'll come home. But I'm coming home as Emily's mother, not as your employee. And that means we'll need to establish new boundaries that reflect my actual role in this family." The negotiation of those new boundaries took several weeks and required the assistance of lawyers who specialized in family law cases that fell outside traditional categories. Richard established a trust fund in Maria's name that provided financial security regardless of her employment status, formal health care benefits that included psychological support for the trauma they had all experienced during Emily's illness, and legal documentation that granted her parental rights and responsibilities that couldn't be arbitrarily revoked. More importantly, he funded the establishment of the Maria Gonzalez Foundation for Family Caregivers, an organization dedicated to supporting domestic workers who provided emotional labor and advocacy within the families they served. The foundation offered legal aid, healthcare benefits, educational opportunities, and most crucially, recognition of the expertise and dedication that professional caregivers brought to the families who depended on them. Emily's homecoming was a celebration that reflected her new understanding of what family meant. The penthouse that had once felt cold despite its expensive beauty was transformed by the presence of someone whose love made every room warmer, every meal more meaningful, every ordinary moment an expression of gratitude for survival and second chances. Maria's bedroom was redecorated to reflect her permanent status in the household, her belongings displayed with the same respect accorded to any family member's possessions. But perhaps the most meaningful change was the wall in the main hallway where Emily's artwork was now displayed in expensive frames alongside a formal portrait of Maria commissioned by Richard as a gesture of respect and recognition. The portrait showed Maria as she truly was, not a servant or employee, but a mother whose love had sustained a child through the most dangerous period of her life, whose advocacy had saved a life that medical professionals might have given up on if left to rely solely on biological family members who were too distracted by other priorities to pay attention to symptoms that mattered. Years have passed since Emily's remission began, years filled with routine medical checkups that continue to bring good news, with ordinary childhood experiences that feel miraculous after months when survival itself was uncertain. Emily is now a healthy, vibrant teenager whose experience with illness has given her an unusual appreciation for the simple pleasure of feeling well, for the luxury of making plans without consulting medical schedules, for the gift of hair that grows and energy that sustains her through normal adolescent activities. She excels in school, particularly in science classes where her early exposure to medical terminology and procedures has given her an advantage in understanding complex biological processes. Her teachers describe her as unusually empathetic, someone who notices when classmates are struggling and offers help without being asked. She volunteers at the hospital where she was treated, reading to younger patients and helping with art projects that bring color and creativity to sterile medical environments. But most tellingly, Emily's relationship with Maria has not only survived the trauma of her illness, but has been strengthened by it. They share the bond of people who have faced mortality together, who understand that love sometimes requires extraordinary sacrifice, who know that families are created not just by blood, but by choice and commitment and the decision to remain present during the most difficult moments of life. Maria continues to live in the Beaumont penthouse, but her role has evolved far beyond traditional caregiving into something that resembles family matriarchy. She manages household decisions, advocates for Emily's educational needs, and serves as the emotional center around which their unconventional family revolves. Richard has learned to defer to her expertise in matters relating to Emily's welfare, recognizing that Maria's years of attentive caregiving have given her insights that his financial success could never provide. The foundation established in Maria's name has grown into a significant force for change within the domestic work industry, providing support and recognition for caregivers whose emotional labor has historically been undervalued and legally unprotected. The organization has helped dozens of domestic workers secure better employment conditions, legal advocacy during disputes with employers, and most importantly, acknowledgement of their expertise and dedication. Richard's business has continued to thrive, his investment portfolio growing through cryptocurrency speculation and international market ventures that have increased his net worth to over $60 million. But his priorities have fundamentally shifted. His success, measured not just by financial returns, but by his ability to create stability and security for the unconventional family that illness and crisis helped him recognize and value. He speaks now at conferences and fundraising events for pediatric cancer research, sharing Emily's story and emphasizing the crucial role that family caregivers play in successful treatment outcomes. His presentations always include recognition of Maria's advocacy and the months when her concerns were dismissed by medical professionals who failed to listen to someone they categorized as just the nanny, rather than as a mother whose observations could save a life. Most evenings, when Richard returns from his office in Midtown Manhattan, he finds Maria and Emily in the kitchen, working together on homework or preparing dinner. Their conversation a mixture of English and Spanish that reflects the bicultural identity Emily has embraced as part of her heritage. These moments, ordinary and unremarkable to outside observers, represent the most valuable return on any investment Richard has ever made, the knowledge that his daughter is loved, protected, and understood by someone whose commitment to her welfare has been tested by crisis and proven unshakable. Emily still keeps the drawings she made for Maria during their years together, artwork that chronicles their relationship from her earliest attempts at representational art through the more sophisticated pieces she creates now as a teenager. The drawings serve as a visual record of their bond, evidence of love that survived employment termination, medical crisis, and the complex negotiations required to create a family structure that honored their actual relationship rather than the artificial boundaries that wealth and social convention had tried to impose. On quiet Sunday mornings, they still go to Central Park together, though their activities have evolved from feeding ducks and riding carousels to more sophisticated teenage pursuits. Emily plays soccer and pickup games while Maria watches from benches that have become familiar over the years, cheering from the sidelines with the pride of any mother watching her daughter pursue her passions and develop her talents. These park visits serve as weekly reminders of how far they've traveled together, from the early years when Emily's chatter filled every silence to the frightening months when her voice grew weak from illness, to these current days when her laughter once again rings across playgrounds and athletic fields with the uninhibited joy that survived cancer treatment and emerged even stronger on the other side. As evening approaches and Manhattan's skyline begins twinkling with lights that represent thousands of stories unfolding simultaneously across the city, Maria and Emily make their way home to the penthouse that represents not just financial success, but the harder-won achievement of learning to value what truly matters. Their conversations during these walks cover the ordinary concerns of teenage life, school assignments, friend drama, college applications, but underneath runs the deeper current of people who understand that every ordinary day is a gift, that health is not guaranteed, that love expressed and recognized is the only wealth that really matters. And have you ever loved someone else's child as your own? Have you ever had your concerns dismissed by people who should have trusted your judgment? Have you watched from the sidelines while advocating for someone whose voice wasn't being heard by those with power to help? Tell me your story in the comments below, because every caregiver's experience matters. Every act of invisible love deserves recognition. Every person who has put another's welfare ahead of their own convenience has contributed to the quiet network of support that keeps families functioning and children thriving. If Maria's story touched something in your heart, if you recognize yourself in her years of patient advocacy or her willingness to love without guarantee of appreciation, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel so that her message reaches other women who need to hear that their work matters, that their love is seen, that their dedication makes a difference even when it goes unacknowledged by those who benefit from it most. For more stories that celebrate the hidden heroes who shape our lives through daily acts of devotion, click on the link to our podcast where we explore the complex relationships between love, family, and the social structures that both support and constrain our deepest human connections. Thank you for walking this emotional journey with us. We'll meet again soon with another story that honors the quiet strength of people who choose love over recognition, service over acclaim, and human connection over the easier path of emotional distance.